What was the most disturbing thing you saw in person? One time I was having a sleepover at my friend's house, and she died in her sleep. Waking up and seeing her was pretty disturbing. About 8 years ago, I working as a train conductor, my locomotive engineer and I hit a young woman with an 8,000-ton freight train traveling 40 miles per hour. After applying the emergency brakes, it was my job to get out and visually check to see if we indeed had an accident. I found her contorted body in seemingly impossible ways near the side of the tracks. I radioed 911 to my dispatcher and emergency services were immediately called. She unfortunately passed away not long after the ambulance arrived. An elderly man on a bike get hit by a truck. I had to hold his head together with my shirt to try and stop the bleeding until the ambulance came. I was waiting at a bus stop, and on the other side of the rather tall divider were 3 bikers waiting for the light behind a bus, at a major intersection. Moments later, another bus came up behind, but realized too late it had no brakes. Several people injured, but 2 of the 3 bikers were squished to pulp. One was thrown to the pavement on the far side of the road, and survived with injuries. I never dared cross the road and look on the other side of that divider. It was in the papers the next morning. Motorcycle rider missing their head. Launched across highway, run over by numerous cars before traffic stopped. Head was removed with helmet. Was walking through a city with a friend when we saw a guy on a bike, no helmet, come down a steep street right in front of us. Something made his bike flip and he went headfirst onto the stone cobble street. The cracking noise and the amount of blood was something I'm not going to forget anytime soon. Ambulance and so on showed up pretty fast, but I have no idea if he survived. I'd like to think so, but there was so much blood on the street I don't know if I can believe it. The so-called caring loving Christian church I will never go back to after tonight, invite homeless people for a midnight dinner. Then telling them they can't have a plate, unless they pay $3 for it. The pastor took a plate out of a homeless dude's hand and said God would feed him. I left my wallet at home and they didn't even let me, a member of the church, get a plate for my 2-year-old son who was crying. They said let the paying Christians eat first and then if there was leftovers we can have some, when he said God willing and amen. I had to hold back from punching him. I left early and decided after that experience I'm never going back to church. Tonight broke my heart. I've given up so much for this church, only now do I realize, the credit card readers for donations, twice a service probably isn't going to feed the homeless like they say, but to buy all those fancy flat screens LG brand TVs all over the church. The pastor has rims on his car. I've been an idiot. While some of the messages were good. After them doing what they did tonight. I'll never go back. Was riding with my dad and siblings one morning on our way to school. There's a bridge we drive under every day. That morning we all saw a body hanging from that bridge. When we got home from school, the body was finally in the process of being taken down. I was no contact with my abusive addict mom for many years. She passed in 2020, a sheriff's deputy found her during a wellness check. It was declared that she had been dead for a couple of weeks in July heat with no utilities. My father and I drove to her house the day after they removed her body. You could smell the decomposition from a block away. She had cancelled trash services and had 3+ years of garbage bags piled to the ceiling in her garage. There were rats running all over the house. 99.9% of our family pictures were pissed on or eaten by rats and not salvageable. Both of her toilets were out of order and full to the brim with crap. Everything I saw in her house was absolute nightmare fuel. My dad died alone in the camper he was living in when he bled out from his alcoholism. I didn't find the body, my brother did, but my sister and I helped him clean the camper so he could sell it. I think I've blocked the memory of the smell. It was summer and we don't know how long he laid there, but I remember blood spattered everywhere like a horror movie, and empty jug after empty jug that had held cheap vodka. I remember tossing the cushion he laid on as unsalvageable, but can't recall exactly what it looked like. I appreciate that my brain is protecting me from a lot of the details. Witnesses a rollover during a blizzard. I called for emergency services as I approached and assessed the situation. One of the occupants was partially ejected through the sun roof and had his head pinned beneath the vehicle. He was alive and conscious but in dire need of extrication. He was screaming about the pressure. Myself and others arriving collected vehicle jacks and began trying to lift the vehicle off of him. We were making good progress. We had managed to make some space for him, but he was still stuck when the firemen arrived and took over. They replaced our jacks with dunnage, think wooden railway ties, in a stack and then used airbags to lift the vehicle. Unfortunately, as the weight of the vehicle was taken by the airbags, everything slid and the dunnage collapsed. The vehicle landed full force on his head again with a sickening crunch, and that was it. I had almost gotten this man out, but the professionals took over and killed him in front of me. I watched a guy get sucker punched outside a club, not uncommon where I used to live, but he fell back and hit his head and a pool of blood started spreading from the back of his head. I always wonder whether he died/had long-lasting damage. Domestic abuse in the middle of a street. I thought they were strangers and that she was trying to get away from him and he wouldn't accept it. He kept holding on to her and trying to drag her with him while she kept begging him to let her go. We stopped and she looked at us and asked for help. He took off when he saw us walk towards them. She then let us know that they were married, but at least she wouldn't get beaten up that night since we interfered. She would go spend the night at her sister's place, and she wouldn't divorce him because there were kids involved. I hope she did end up divorcing him, and those kids weren't too scarred of having to survive growing up with their father beating their mother. My best friend and I were supposed to be pet/house sitting, and when we showed up on the first day, the owner, guy who hired us, and his brother were both dead in the house. There was a note and it was ruled a murder-suicide. Younger brother showed up at the house in a drug-fueled rage and older brother didn't know it was him and shot him. Then when he realized who it was, he wrote a note and killed himself. Probably seeing the burn marks on a pediatric patient who was desperate for help due to persistent SA from a family member. Never been so pissed in my life at someone I had never met. Wish I could have broken the perpetrator's orbitals, so he could never look at another child the same way again. Watched my mum's friend's boyfriend insert steak knives into his girlfriend while they had a rough domestic. I was 12 and my mum was too cooked to help. Honestly, I've seen a lot of bad injuries and fights, but the worst thing was probably when I was a kid, went to a friend's house out in the country, gun shooting, cooking and hanging out, good times. Anyways, one time they were having a small get-together, and one of the people that came brought 6 live rabbits. I watched guy kill them, about 4 of them, by breaking their necks, and skin them. Even taught me how to skin one, which was neat, but then another guy said, "Hey, let me try," proceeded to smack a rabbit full force against the wall. Which only knocked it out. And proceeded to just drive a knife under its skin, and the shrieking sound that it made will forever be a noise that I can't forget and honestly makes me so fucking sad. Driving home one night, I stopped at a light and caught a glimpse of a street person pulling a shopping cart in the road down the cross street. Lost sight of him quickly because it was poorly lit. A few seconds later there was a shower of sparks as an oncoming car plowed into the guy and his shopping cart. He was killed immediately. I was in a house, under somewhat precarious circumstances, and someone walked in the front door and shot the person standing right next to me in the heart and killed them. It just happened to be Valentine's Day. Someone painted racial slurs onto an African American man's truck, and that man had to go to work that day with it still there. That man was fired because of it. I didn't see the whole thing unfold, I had to hear it from him after he had been homeless for the last decade, sleeping in the very same truck. The paint never came off. One of my patients was not a fan of good hygiene. She had inverted nipples and a filthy stinky plug made out of dirt and sweat and old skin etc. came out when pulling back her boobs to clean in the nipples. My own mother being attacked by a dog while holding the cat I had grown up with. Our neighbors raced greyhounds and our cat was sunbaking outside on the veranda. One of their greyhounds had escaped the pen they were housed in and wasn't wearing a muzzle. Unfortunately, our cat was the first live thing the dog spotted at the same time my mother walked out the front door. She tried quickly grabbing the cat, but by the time she had gotten to him the dog had reached our veranda, knocking my mother off onto the ground a few feet down and began to fight for both of their lives. Luckily I was home at the time as well as my father, who was asleep after a long night at work. I heard her screams for help, ran outside to the scene and was stunned for a few moments before screaming for my father, who raced outside to try separating the dog from them both, who had by this time ripped shreds into my mother's arms and dislocated our cat's hip, but luckily both were alive. A ranger and ambulance was called and then a few days later police attended, although when they approached our neighbors to locate the dog they had hidden it away on another property which was eventually located. To this day, years on, they have never approached any of us to apologize. When I was 7 and staying at my dad's, illegally since he never had custody of me, seeing as he was a known pedophile and got me kidnapped, out of the corner of my eye I saw my dad and one of his friends slip something into my orange juice. The next thing I knew I was trapped and completely paralyzed but totally and completely awake and could only move my eyes, and I saw my dad and his friends doing stuff to me and it felt like it lasted an eternity.